So Doug is
Apparently. Are you feeling okay?
Doug is the man
Or beer.
that enjoys LiDAR.
Yeah.
No, that wasn't very convincing.
Yes, yes. I love LiDAR.
And you love grass.
I have a bumper sticker that says I love LiDAR. I was just surprised it let me talk about grass a little bit here.
Well, you know, just kind of, you know, you got the green of QGIS up there, so it works.
All right. It works for me. Okay, so why would you want to create your own DEM from a reprojected point cloud? Well, why would you want to reproject a point cloud of LiDAR data? Well, if you've got two data sets, like two states, and their LiDAR is in different projections, and you want to work with across both states in a common projection, you can reproject all the points, recreate the DEM, and start working with it. Another reason is that if you've got a data set like satellite imagery that's in UTM zone, and all your point data is in state plane, you can reproject your points and then set your cell size for your analysis exactly the cell size of the satellite imagery, so that you can basically treat it as another band when you do your satellite imagery analysis. PDL is your friend. It's open source under MIT license, I believe, and you can get it using Conda on Windows. You can also do Conda on Linux, or you can compile it from source. Either way. So reprojection can change the DEM values, and like I said, you can change the DEM to match your stuff, and I've already done that slide, so let's go ahead. Occasionally you see something interesting in the official DEMs you get from the agencies. Like this is the upper end of Roanoke Rapids Reservoir in North Carolina. And when there isn't a specific break line put in, when ArcGIS creates a terrain, it's usually just doing tins in terrain, so you end up with these triangles across what is flat water. That irritates me. So that's the other reason to go ahead and recreate your DEM. Now, this is what I did last time, talking about doing canopy heights across a chunk of southeast Virginia. I reprojected the DEM and analyzed the point cloud from the reprojected DEM, and reprojected the point cloud, created a DEM, then did canopy heights out of it for a big chunk of southeastern Virginia. But this needed to be redone because I wanted to continue this work, and when I was hooking up my hard drives to a new power supply, I used the wrong cable, and well, 9 terabytes of hard drive space just sort of went away. So, new hard drive. But while you have a hardware casualty, it gives you a chance to think. It says, you know, was I doing this the most efficient way? Can I improve my accuracy? Because what I was doing, let me get a little bit further along. The things you have to think about is when you're doing surface interpolation methods, vector is very nice when you're working with tiles. But I tried to work with the data a county at a time, which is usually over 1,000 tiles in a shot. And you either need a lot of memory to do that, or it's going to take a very long time to do that as a vector data set, vector analysis. The building footprints, you also need to interpolate the surface under there, and it'd be nice if you could pull out the footprints themselves while you're doing it. And water bodies, for me, vegetation-wise, it's not a big issue, but since we're going ahead and analyzing vegetation and recreating the DEM, let's see what we can do about it. So, this is the kind of approach I took. You go through and say, okay, I want to do a binning exercise where I set a cell size, and for every cell, I want to take the mean Z value of every ground point that falls in that cell. And then for the gaps that I have in between there, for the small gaps, I'm just going to do inverse distance weighting interpolation. For the larger gaps, I want to, like they're represented by water or building gaps, large buildings like shopping malls. For a lot of the small houses, the interpolation will take care of. Then I'm going to fill those in with a very large value, and then I'm going to use that as something to buffer out from. And you buffer out one cell, and then you mask for that, and get that strip of values, and then you do your other analysis from that. To simplify this, just think cookie cutters, okay? So where you have a cookie cutter, you're pressing it down in, what I'm trying to get out is where that cookie cutter is actually cutting out of the dough. That's the strip of raster values around the void that I want to get. And the actual cookie itself that's left behind is what I'm trying to create as a single value in the raster. So, as I said, you do RN LiDAR for grass. It takes a couple of hours to do that for this area, 1,300 for the area I'm looking at, 1,300 tiles. And using mean moderates the outliers. When you have LiDAR data, you have outliers. A lot of times when a LiDAR beam will hit water, it does what is commonly known as squirrely things. You may either have really high values or very low values. So you put in the mean value to try to moderate some of that. And it's a QL2 data that I was working with in my demo here. It's 0.7 of a meter point spacing in wide open areas that have no obstructions. So building a 1 meter DEM should be fine. Now, let me see. So where you see these, this is what the raw RN LiDAR gives you for all the white areas are voids in the data. And you can see that you'll have a lot of swampy areas here. You've got just a pond in the development. You can see all the houses that are the regularly, there's no ground points that are houses. There's a natural water body up there, and the houses themselves. If you look at the illustration in the upper left-hand corner, that's the Virginia Beach, which is sort of, it's a city, but it's also a county. Virginia's funny that way. That represents 1,399 tiles that I processed in one shot using RN LiDAR. And it took probably 4 to 6 hours to do that. Something like that. Maybe a little bit more for that one. But you start with that. Then you go through and do a nifty routine called R fill gaps, which is an add-on for grass. With the -P, it leaves the original values in place and just interpolates for the gaps. And that tremendously speeds up the processing. So for that area that I showed you before, it only took about 40 minutes to do this for the entire area. And you've got a lot of the small gaps have been filled in. Now for the water bodies, you've gone in about 5 cells. So, but we're going to take care of that. So the first thing you do is you copy the layer that you've got, and then in GRASS there's an NULL command. So everything that's a missing data is considered a null. So you just set all the nulls to an extremely large value. I took 30,000 because, well, Mount Everest is 29,000 feet. So whether you use meters or feet, 30,000 is going to be higher than any actual real data you've got. And then you basically then divide your elevation by 30,000, convert it to an integer. So anything less than 30,000 is going to be 0, and 30,000 is 1. So you have a raster of 1 representing all those gaps. Then you just get rid of all the zeros, so you just have 1 and no data. Then you do a ring buffer on the no data areas that are now, the 10,000. This is the original no data that was converted, and now it's a 1. Then you do a ring buffer out, and what you want to do is then you're going to look at and choose the ring layer that represents the original data. So right at the shoreline. It's not going to be perfect because the way the LiDAR works, it's going to be sort of a jagged edge from the original data. But when you did the interpolation, that actually smoothed it out. So you're going to end up with data in everywhere on that ring. And once you've made this buffer, then you can use the value of the buffer in that raster that's created as a mask layer. So you say, I want to mask to value 6, I think, for this one. And then you just multiply by 1, and you've got a ring around on the shoreline of every water body and the ring around every building. And the values of the rasters in there are the mean elevations surrounding them. Okay? And yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Now, you actually come back. Let me go back up a little bit. So we then go back and do a reclassification, and we ignore the outer ones, everything above the value that we used for our strip, and then everything else from there inward we convert to 1. And that gives us the top of our cookie cutter on top of the null values and includes that strip. All right? So once you've got that, then you go through and you run our clump, and it assigns a unique value to every individual area, every water body, every house. Then you go in and run univariate statistics, R univariate, and you can say, I'm going to run statistics on the strips, but I want them partitioned out by that clumped layer that's sitting on top of it. So that when I end up, I've got a zone, which is each one of those clumps that's associated with the statistics for all the strip values. Now, first, I talked to a guy at USGIS about this. He suggested I use the minimum value. Well, when I looked at that, because LiDAR next to water gets squirrely, the minimum value turned out to be a lot of times like 20 or 30 feet below what we knew it was. So, can't use the minimum value. But, started looking at the first quartile. And that value seems to be fairly representative of what the water level should be. So you have, well, for the area that we had before, I had a couple 100,000 of these things, and you just chuck it into Python, and you take that first column, keep it the same, but you take the, let me get back here. Hey, John, get back here. But you multiply this one by 100 and convert it to an integer that truncates out a couple of decimal places down, so you're down to 100ths of a meter in this case. Converts it to an integer, then you can very simply use an R reclass again, and for each one of these zones, and you change that zone number to 100 times the elevation of the water body according to the first quartile. So I've got a Python script that does this. It's written in Python 2.7. I'll have to change it to 3 now that GRASS has moved to 3. And then all you have to do is then do a little bit of trimming of the raster so that all you have left is of those water bodies, you trim out the outer edge of it so it just fits within that strip. And then you use that as an inverse mask layer to cut holes in your interpolated layer and then fit them back together, and you've got a seamless one. And so it seems like a lot of trouble. Why not just use the breaklines that come with a lot of the data set? Well, you know, you look up there, a lot of the breaklines are generated in a vector format and done labor intensively. You don't get a lot of the water bodies that are not large. You also do not get building footprints. So if you see up there, that's the break lines for this area. And down here is what I've got for my water bodies from this method. What about accuracy? Well, hey, the break line, this is, let me actually go back up here. This is Back Bay in Virginia right here. It actually connects down in here to North Carolina. So it's part of an estuarine system, flat water. And so if I look at the USGS gauge, it's on the same water body, just a little farther south, it's showing me that your mean value is, you know, either a little above, usually have, because it's a wind tide during the summer, it's a little higher than sea level, but this is NBD 88. And you can see that the actual mean value would be close to 0, because it's pretty close to sea level. Well, in the break line, it's like -1 meter. And you go to this little, on this island, you go into that interior one, it's -1.3 meters. Whereas just doing the statistics on the real data surrounding the Back Bay, including the islands in the middle, that strip on the island as well as the strip on the edge, I get a value of 0.06, which is much closer to the real value than I'm getting in the break lines. I'm not saying they're break lines in error. They set the break lines as a means of forcing the water, the ground slope to go down in the water. So they have specific contractual guidelines to make sure that happens. But I feel a lot more confident in my mind about using this method to generate water levels. All right, yeah, we already covered that. Now, problem areas for my method, double line rivers. I'm sure you were all thinking about this. How do you do rivers? Well, I haven't figured that out yet. I'll be honest with you on that. When you have rivers that feed into reservoirs, that's going to throw off the reservoir. But you can very easily convert these raster areas that I've talked about into vectors, into polygons, then clip them right at the reservoir edge, and then you go back and rerun this, and you're good. And buildings, some of them set into a hillside, they're going to come up, you know, you're going to get the lowest value in there, and it's going to make the building seem like it's taller than it is. Of course, if the foundation was dug down there, then yes, it is that tall. And you have to have a way of identifying problem areas. Well, let's go back to our statistics, and you get the standard deviation there. So I said, well, let's just look at different increments of 1 foot in the standard deviation and see what that does for us. And so I just went back and ran another part of the Python script that just puts it into 5 different classes. And you end up with a series of standard deviation values where the green and yellow are the larger ones, and the one in the below are good. So this lake is green because it connects by a canal all the way through, down to the sound. If you zoom in a little bit on it, you see that pretty much all the buildings are fine. A lot of the water bodies are really good. Anything that connects in to the sound is going to be different, but if you just create an artificial boundary right at the mouth of those creeks, then that'll make the sound all the same elevation. And you go from there. You get a couple of things down in here. I'm not really sure what they are. But then you merge everything together and you've got a DEM for the whole area. As you can tell, it's a really low-lying area of Virginia with a couple of yellow spots, which I suspect are landfills. Those tend to be the high points in those coastal areas. So you go ahead and, as usual, you got more questions than your answers. I mean, it's good enough for me for right now for redoing my vegetative analysis. So I'll go ahead and go with it. But, you know, I've already talked to some folks that do hydrologic work, and they're like, oh, this is good. So at least a good start. So I think the next step in this is that we're going to have to take those areas that have a larger gradient as calculated by the standard deviation values, split those off into, convert those to vectors and points and lines, and then do analysis of those, and hopefully we can get to the point where we can do an interpolation from one side, a point on one side to the other, get the mean x, y, and z value, drop it down maybe 1/10 of a unit, and that way you can have a hydro and force layer in which the water is forced to go into the middle of the channel. Now, if we can get to an automated process for that, life would be good. But since I'm doing this in my spare time, I don't see it happening anytime soon, unless somebody else wants to jump in and do it. But I think about all of this could be done in GRASS. I just have to think about it a little while longer. But in the meantime, I get back to what I want to do in the first place, which was, creating canopy height off of a reprojected DEM from reprojected point cloud. And actually, that's a good place to end. Do I have any questions? Yes.
Are you running Breaklines through QGIS at all, or just in the command line?
Actually, when I'm doing exploratory stuff like this, I use the GUI in GRASS. I think, I'm not sure if you can get to RN LiDAR through the QGIS interface to GRASS.
Yeah, you can.
You can?
Yeah, you can.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Well, the earlier ones it wasn't, but
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is in this one because they're well, I know V and LiDAR. So the GRASS tools are exposed in QGIS, and you can run them. There's currently a buggy. They use GRASS 7.6. It came with QGIS.
761.
And 761 fixes all the bugs, but on Ubuntu it's 7.6. On
Right.
Linux it's 7.6. I think on Windows it's 7.61. Maybe,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Well, there's also if you on Windows you have the LAZ library for compressed data, but on Ubuntu you don't.
Yeah.
The other thing is that the plugins or add-ons for GRASS are not available to you in QGIS. You have to run GRASS directly for that. Any more questions?
So if from start to finish, county's worth of LiDAR to get all the lakes broken out, how long does that take?
Actually, let's see now. It probably takes about, now that I've got enough memory on my computer, probably about 6 to 8 hours to do the first RN LiDAR for the 1 meter. Takes another 45 minutes to do the interpolation, IDW interpolation, and then the rest of it just takes probably just a few minutes for some of our map calc stuff. So you're probably talking about, if you script everything out, then you could probably get it to go through and do a county in probably about 10 to 12 hours. Maybe less, it depends on the speed of your CPU, the speed of your hard drive access.
How do you have the data stored?
LAZ.
No, so hardware wise, you said you had a 8 terabyte or 9 terabyte hard drive. And how do you have that?
Well, right now it's sitting in a 4 terabyte.
But is that a SSD?
No,
or
it's
is
just
it
spinning drive.
Okay, and just mounted SATA drive.
Yeah. I actually, for some of the work I've done in my day job, I have all of the LAZ data sitting on USB 3 drives, and I just pull it in that way. You set up, for RN LiDAR, you basically do a listing of the directory of LAZ files, capture that to a file, and you have to make sure that it is a complete tree listing, so it starts at C: on Windows and then goes down to the directory tree. And RN LiDAR, you can reference that ASCII file, and it treats everything in that as if it were part of one continuous point cloud. So you can do, I'm trying to think how many thousands of tiles I've done in one shot. I know I've done over 5,000 in one shot. It's all single threaded for the moment. Also, and LiBLAST is what I was using right now, is the library that plugged into GRASS. But as of May, I think they're using Poodle as the back end instead of LiBLAST, because LiBLAST is sort of abandoned. But Poodle is now, I think, hooked into GRASS 7.8, I think. If it's not in 7.8, it's in the 7.9 tree for 8.0. So that means you'll have a pretty good, and there are actually some nicer things about Poodle than LiBLAST that I'm hoping will help on the vector end as well. Any other questions? Okay.
What were you using the tree canopy, the heights for? What was your specific use?
Interest, use, it's sort of, in my day job, I do things with birds and try to get percent canopy cover, not percent but percentage of trees in watersheds. And I didn't have time to do North Carolina, to Virginia, so I was working on North Carolina, so I just started doing things, experiment a little on stuff in Virginia. So eventually I'll just make it available. I mean, part of this can be made, anyone who asks me for the old data set, I'll give you that. I'll just share out from the Google Drive. But I eventually will make this data set available to whoever wants it, who wants to work on, like I said, I do like point locations of birds, observations. I do a 25-meter buffer around them, and then you do the statistics on that. You get an idea of what the bird wants. And that's at a landscape scale. That's what I'm shooting for. Is so you don't just look at a small section, you're looking at a larger chunk of the bird's habitat.